Hello, everybody. Happy Monday. How are you, Miss Deborah? Oh. Ishmael, hello. Is your wife listening? Is your wife listening in with you today? Ooh, words are... Good. Good, Miss Deborah. I'm glad. Can you guys hear my music all right? I just turned it up a little bit. So for anybody who has just stumbled upon this live, welcome, welcome. You have stumbled upon a book reading. So we are obviously reading from this series. We are into book 2 of 4. Oh, Holly's here, go to sleep. Okay, well, when she sees this, tell her I said hello. So if you have missed any of our previous book readings, and not even just of this book, but of other... Oh, thank you for my hat and mustache. Thank you. If you've missed any of the other books that we've read through so far, you can actually find them on my YouTube channel. So just go, to the bio here in TikTok and hit the little YouTube icon, and it'll take you right to my page. And you can see my book reading playlist, and you can also see my main content from TikTok that I do, like my Department of Infernal Appeals content. So if you happen to miss any of these readings, or if you just want to go back and just, listen to them because you so very much love the sultry sound of my voice, feel free to, go onto my YouTube and maybe become a new subscriber. That would be fantastic. I'm creeping ever closer to 1,000 subscribers, and then I can go live on TikTok or on YouTube as well as TikTok. So if you know any friends or family who would love to listen to me drone on and read books, send them my way. Send them my way on YouTube. If they don't happen to have TikTok, they can always see me on that YouTube platform anyway. So for all of our newbies, we usually get started at like 8:05, and we'll read for about an hour. So I give people a chance to grab their favorite drink and get into their jammies, or, get set up so you can listen to me read while you make dinner or anything like that. Oh, hi Tracy, thank you. But yeah, so we'll get started in a few minutes, and then we'll read for about an hour, depending on how long or short some of these chapters are. So I am so cold. It has been chilly all day here, and it was like in the 30s last night. And we're desperately trying to not turn the AC or the heat on in the house yet, because it's like, save money on energy bills. So like, I'm bundled up, and I found my book reading earrings. I bought these earrings specifically to wear so when I read, I can wear them, and I never wear them. And so I'm getting them out again. So look at my cute little book earrings. Aren't they cute? So cute. I got these in Rehoboth. I can't remember what store I got them at, but I got them at Rehoboth, and they're absolutely adorable. I love them to pieces. They're wood, so they're super light. I love them. I love them so much. But yes, I hope your weekend has been fantastic, and I hope your Monday has gone, as well as any Monday can go. We still have a lot of week left. And normally I'm sipping water, but today is a coffee day. I couldn't help it. And my husband was super sweet and surprised me last week he got the Bridgerton berries and cream coffee creamer. This is not an endorsement, but guys, it tastes so good. It tastes so good. Oh my God. It's not overly sweet, and I don't like really sweet stuff, so it's like the perfect, for me, this is perfect. It's got great flavor without being like sickeningly sweet. You know what I mean? One of my best friends, she loves anything and everything sweet. And I just can't. I just can't. I've never had a big sweet tooth, but, which I guess is good. I'm not a snacker of candy, so there you go. But it is now 8:05. So we're gonna go ahead and get started on some reading. Nope. I wanna turn that down. Okay. Yeah, okay. So for anybody who's following along, real quick before I get started, let me know if the volume is okay. Like, can you give me like a thumbs up or oh, thank you. A thumbs up or something like that, just so I know that you guys can hear me, okay? I'm pretty sure you can, but I always want to make sure before I start reading, just for peace of mind. Fabulous. Okay, great. So for anyone who happens to maybe have this book, any of these books, in Gathering Blue, we are on chapter 11. If you want to follow along, you don't have to. It's okay. Chapter 11. Kira, trembling, hurried into the clearing where Annabella's small house stood. She was alone this morning. Matt still accompanied her occasionally, but he was bored by the old dyer and her endless instructions. More often, he and his dog were off with his friends, dreaming up adventures. Matt was still annoyed about the bath. His mates had laughed at him when they saw him clean. So this morning, Kira made her own way down the forest path. This morning, for the first time, she had been frightened. What's wrong? Annabella was at the outdoor fire. She must have risen before dawn to have the fire so hot by now. It crackled and spat under the huge iron kettle, yet the sun had barely risen when Kira set out. Catching her breath, Kira limped past the gardens to where the old woman stood, sweating as the heat from the flames pulsed and shimmered in the air. There was an aura of safety here, Kira felt. She willed her body to relax. You have a fear look to you, the dyer observed. A beast followed me on the path, Kira explained, trying to breathe normally. The panic was beginning to subside, but she still felt tense. I could hear it in the bushes. I could hear its steps, and sometimes it growled. To her surprise, Annabella chuckled. The old woman had always been kind to her and patient. Why would she laugh at her fear? I can't run, Kira explained, because of my leg. No need of running, Annabella said. She stirred the water in the pot, which was beginning to show occasional small bubbles at the surface. We'll boil coneflowers for a brownish green, she said. Just the flower heads. The leaves and stems make gold. With a nod of her head, she indicated a filled sack of flower heads on the ground nearby. Kira picked up the sack. When Annabella, testing the water with her stick, nodded, she emptied the massed blossoms into the pot. Together they watched as the mixture began to simmer. Then Annabella laid her stirring stick on the ground. Come inside, the old woman said. I'll give you tea for calming. From a nearby, smaller fire, she lifted a kettle from its hook and carried it into the cot. Kira followed her. She knew the flower heads would have to boil till midday, and then remain steeping in their water for many hours more. Extracting the colors was always a slow process. The coneflower dye water would not be ready for use until the next morning. The dyeing yard, affected by the fire, was already sultry and almost oppressive, but inside the cot was cool, protected by its thick walls. Dried plants, beige and fragile, hung from the ceiling rafters. On a thick wooden table by the window, piles of colored yarns lay all ready for sorting. It was part of Kira's learning to name and sort the threads. She went to her place at the sorting table, set her stick against the wall, and sat down. Behind her, Annabella poured water from the kettle over dried leaves that she had placed in 2 thick mugs. This deep brown is from the goldenrod shoots, isn't it? Kira held the strands to the window light. It looks lighter than when it was wet, but it's still a fine brown. She had helped the dyer prepare the shoots for their dye bath a few days before. Annabella brought the mugs to the table. She glanced at the strands in Kira's hand and nodded. The goldenrod be blossoming soon. We'll use the blossoms fresh, not dried, for brightest yellow. And the blossoms boil only a short time, not as long as the shoots. More bits of knowledge to grasp and hold in her memory. She would ask Thomas to write them down with the rest. Kira sipped at the strong hot tea and thought again about the ominous stalking sound in the woods. I was so frightened on my way here, she confessed. Truly, Annabella, I can't run at all. My leg's a useless thing. She looked down at it, ashamed. The old woman shrugged. It brung you here, she said. Yes, and I'm grateful for that, but I move so slowly. Kira stroked the rough side of the earthen mug, thinking. When Matt and Branch come with me, nothing stalks me. Maybe Matt would let me bring Branch each day. Even a little dog might scare the beasts back. Annabella laughed. There be no beasts, she said. Kira stared at her. Of course no beasts would come to this clearing where fires glowed, and the old woman seemed never to leave the clearing, never to walk the path to the village. All I need be here, she told Kira, speaking disdainfully of the village and its noisy life. But still she had lived to be 4 syllables, and had acquired 4 generations of wisdom. Why did she suddenly sound like an ignorant tyke, pretending that there was no danger? Like Matt, beating his chest with bravado and pasting it thick with swamp grass that he called a manly pelt. Pretending didn't keep you safe. I heard it growl, Kira said in a low voice. Name the threads, Annabella commanded. Kira sighed. Yarrow, she said, and set some pale yellow next to the deep brown. The dyer nodded. She examined a brighter yellow in the light. Tansy, she decided finally, and the dyer nodded again. It growled, Kira said once more. There be no beasts, the dyer repeated firmly. Kira continued to sort and name the threads. Matter, she said, stroking the deep red, one of her favorites. She picked up a pale lavender near it and frowned. I don't know this one. It's pretty. Elderberry, the old woman told her, but it don't stay fast. It don't linger. Kira folded the lavender threads in her hand. Annabella, she said finally, it growled. It did. Then it be human, playing at beast, Annabella told her in a firm and certain voice, meaning to keep you scared of the woods. There be no beasts. Together, slowly, they sorted and named the threads. Later, walking home through a silent forest with no frightening sounds from the thick bushes on either side of the path, Kira wondered what human would have stalked her, and why. Thomas, Kira asked as they ate together, have you ever seen a beast? Not alive. You've seen a dead one then. We all have, when the hunters bring them in. The other night, remember? They brought them in after the hunt. There was a huge pile over by the butcher's yard. Kira wrinkled her nose, remembering. What a smell, she said. But, Thomas? He waited for her question. Tonight for dinner they had been brought meat in a thick sauce. Beside it, on a plate, were some small roasted potatoes. Kira pointed at the meat on her own plate. This is what the hunters brought. It's hare, I think. He nodded, agreeing. Everything the hunters brought in was like this. Wild rabbit, some birds. There wasn't anything very large. There were deer. I saw 2 at the butcher's. But deer are gentle, frightened things. The hunters bring nothing with claws or fangs. They never catch anything that could be called a beast. Thomas shuddered. Lucky. A beast could kill. Kira thought of her father, taken by beasts. Annabella says there be none, she confided. Be none? Thomas looked puzzled. That's the way she said it. There be no beasts. She speaks like Matt? Thomas had not met the old dyer. Kira nodded. A bit. Perhaps she grew up in the fen. They ate in silence for a moment. Finally, Kira asked again, So you've never seen a real beast? No, Thomas acknowledged. But probably you know someone who has. He thought for a moment and then shook his head. Do you? He asked. Kira looked at the table. It had always been hard to talk of it, even to her mother. My father was taken by beasts, she told him. You saw it? His voice was shocked. No, I was not yet born. Your mother saw? She tried to remember her mother's telling. No, she didn't. He went on the hunt. Everyone says that he was a fine hunter, but he didn't return. They came to my mother with the news that he'd been attacked and taken by beasts on the hunt. She looked at him, puzzled. Yet Annabella says there be none. How could she know? Thomas asked skeptically. She's 4 syllables, Thomas. Those who live to 4 syllables know all there is. Thomas nodded in agreement, then yawned. He had been working hard all day. His tools still lay on the work table, small chisels with which he had been meticulously recarving, reshaping the worn, smooth places on the elaborate staff that the singer used. It was painstaking work that allowed for no error. Thomas had told her that often his head ached, and he had to stop again and again to rest his eyes. I'll go so you can rest, Kira told him. I must put away my own work before bed. She returned to a room at the other end of the corridor and folded the robe that still lay on her table. She had worked on the stitchery throughout the afternoon, after her return from the forest. She had shown it to Jameson, as she did each day, and he had nodded in approval. Now Kira was tired too. The long walks to the dyer's cot each day were exhausting, but at the same time the fresh air made her feel cleansed and invigorated. Thomas should get outside more, she thought, and then laughed to herself. She sounded like a scolding mother. After a bath, how she enjoyed the warm water now. Kira put on the simple nightgown that was provided clean for her each day. Then she went to the carved box and took the scrap of fabric with her to her bed. The fear of the thing in the bushes by the path lingered with her still, and she thought of it as she waited for sleep. Is it true that there be no beasts? Her thoughts framed the question, and her mind responded in a whisper to herself as the fabric lay curled warm in the palm of her hand. There be none. What of my father, then? Him taken by beasts? Kira drifted into sleep, the words gliding slippery from her thoughts. She dreamed the question, her breath soft and even against the pillow. The fabric gave a kind of answer, but it was no more than a flutter, like a breeze across her that she would not remember when she woke at dawn. The scrap told her something of her father, something important, something that mattered, but the knowledge entered her sleep, trembling through like a dream, and in the morning she did not know that it was there at all. Coffee break. Chapter 12. When the bell for rising rang, Kira awoke with a sense that something had changed. She had an awareness of a difference, but had forgotten what the difference was. She sat for a moment on the edge of her bed, thinking, but she could not grasp whatever it was and finally stopped trying. Sometimes, she knew, lost memories and forgotten dreams came back more easily if you put them out of your mind. Outside, it was stormy. Wind shook the trees and blew a sheet of heavy rain against the building. The hard ground below had turned to mud overnight, and it was clear that Kira would not go to the dyer's cot today. Just as well, she thought. There was much work to do on the robe, and autumn's start, the time of the gathering, was approaching. Recently, Jameson had been stopping by sometimes twice a day to see the progress she had made. He seemed pleased by her work. "Here," he had said to her just the day before yesterday, smoothing his hand across the large, undecorated place. Here is where you will start your own work. After this year's gathering, after you've finished with the restoration, you'll have this entire section to work on for years to come." Kira touched the place where his hand lay. She tried to determine whether her fingers would feel the magic there, but there was only emptiness. There was a feeling of unfilled need. He seemed to sense her uncertainty and reassured her. "Don't worry," he said. "We will explain to you what we want pictured there." Kira didn't reply. His reassurance troubled her. It wouldn't be instruction that she needed. It would be the magic to come to her hands. Remembering the conversation, Kira thought suddenly, "Jameson! I can ask him about the beasts." He had told her that he had been part of the hunt that day, that he had seen her father's death. And maybe she would ask Matt, too. Wild little thing that he was, Kira had no doubt that Matt had crossed the boundaries often and had gone to places tykes were not supposed to go. She laughed quietly, thinking of Matt and his mischief. He spied on everything, knew everything. Had she and Thomas not stopped him, he would have tagged along with the men on the hunt and put himself in danger. Perhaps he had done it before. Perhaps he had seen beasts. When the tender came with the morning meal, Kira asked that the lights be lit. The rainstorm made the room dim, even beside the window where she sat to work. Finally, she settled herself with the outspread robe and placed the frame around the newest section waiting to be repaired. As she had often done, she followed with her eyes and fingers the complex story of the world portrayed on the robe, the starting point, long mended now, with the green water, the dark beasts on its shore, and the men bloodied by the hunt. Beyond, villages appeared, with dwellings of all kinds. Curving stitches of smoke from fires were threaded with dull, purplish grays. It was fortunate that it needed no repair because Kira had no threads to match. She thought that they had been dyed with basil, and Annabella had told her how difficult the basil was and how badly it stained your hands. Then complex, whirling patches of fire, oranges, reds, yellows. Here and there on the robe these fires appeared, a repetitive pattern of ruin, and within the intricately stitched patterns of the bright, destructive threads of fire, Kira could see figures of humans portrayed, people destroyed, their tiny villages crumbling, and later, even larger, much more splendid towns burned and ravished by fiery destruction. In some places on the robe there was a feeling of entire worlds ending, yet always there would emerge nearby new growth, new people. Ruin, rebuilding, ruin again, regrowth. Kira followed the scenes with her hand as larger and greater cities appeared and larger, greater destruction took place. The cycle was so regular that its pattern took on a clear form, an up and down movement, wave-like. From the tiny corner where it began, where the first ruin came, it enlarged upon itself. The fires grew as the villages grew. All of them were tiny, created from the smallest stitches and combinations of stitches, but she could see their pattern of growth and how each time the ruin was worse and the rebuilding more difficult. But the sections of serenity were exquisite. Miniature flowers of countless hues flourished in meadows streaked with golden threaded sunlight. Human figures embraced. The pattern of the peaceful times felt immensely tranquil compared to the tortured chaos of the others. Tracing with her finger the white and pink-tinged clouds against the pale skies of gray or green, Kira wished again for blue, the color of the calm. What was it Annabella had said? That they had blue yonder? What did that mean? Who were they? And where was yonder? More unanswered questions. Great sheets of rain spattered against the window, distracting her. Kira sighed and watched the trees bend and sway in the wind. Thunder muttered in the distance. She wondered where Matt was, what he was doing in this weather. She knew that ordinary people, those who lived near the place where she and her mother had shared their cot, would be indoors today, the men sullen and edgy, the women complaining loudly because weather kept them from their usual chores. Tykes, confined, would be fighting and then wailing in response to swift, backhanded slaps from their mothers. Her own life with her soft-spoken, widowed mother had been very different, but it had set her apart too and made others, like Vandara, hostile. "Kira?" She heard Thomas's voice and his knock at her door. "Come in." He came and stood by her window, eyeing the rain. "I was just wondering what Matt's up to in this weather," Kira said. Thomas began to laugh. "Well, I can answer that. He's up to finishing my breakfast. He arrived early this morning, dripping wet. He said his mother threw him out because he was noisy and troublesome. I think he just wanted breakfast, though." "Branch too?" "Branch too, of course." As if in response, they heard the tap-tapping of the dog's feet in the corridor. Then Branch, appearing in the doorway, his head cocked, ears up, bent tail wagging exuberantly. Kira knelt and scratched behind his ear. "Kira?" Thomas was still staring through the window at the rain. She looked up from the dog. "I heard it again in the night. I'm certain of it this time. The sound of a child crying. It seemed to come from the floor below." She looked at him and saw that he was concerned. "I wonder, Kira," he said hesitantly, "would you go with me to explore a bit? I suppose it could just be the sound of wind." It was true that outside the wind was relentless. Tree branches lashed the side of the building and torn leaves whirled away. The sound of the storm, however, was nothing like the sound of a crying child. "Maybe an animal?" Kira suggested. "I've heard cats yowling so that they sound like babies with colicky bellies." "Cats?" Thomas repeated dubiously. "Well, maybe. Or a young goat? They make a crying sound." Thomas shook his head. "It wasn't a goat." "Well, no one ever said we couldn't explore," Kira commented. "Not to me, anyway." "Nor me." "All right, then. I'll go with you. The light's not good for working this morning, anyway." She stood. Branch wiggled with anticipation. "What about Matt? I suppose we could take him along." "Take me where?" Matt appeared in the doorway, damp-haired and barefoot with crumbs on his chin, jam on the edges of his mouth, and wearing a too large woven shirt belonging to Thomas. "Shall we be having an adventure?" "Matt?" Kira remembered her intention to ask him, "Have you ever seen a beast? A real one?" Matt's face lighted. Billions and billions. He had made a beast face, teeth exposed. He roared, and his dog jumped away from him in alarm. Kira rolled her eyes and looked at Thomas. "Here, Branchy." Matt, his beast disguise abandoned, squatted beside the dog, who came forward and sniffed him. "Some smearies for you." He grinned as the dog licked breakfast remains from his face. "Yes, we'll have ourselves an adventure," Kira told him. She laid the protective cover over her robe. "We thought we'd explore a bit. We've never been on the floor below this one." Matt's eyes widened in delight at the idea of an exploration. "I heard a noise last night," Thomas explained. "Probably nothing, but we thought we'd go and take a look." "Noise don't ever be nothing," Matt pointed out. "Quite rightly," Kira thought. "Well, it's probably nothing important," Thomas amended. "But maybe it'd be interesting," Matt said eagerly. Together, followed by the dog, the three started down the corridor toward the stairs. Welcome to everybody who has just joined us for our reading. We are reading from this series. We're in Book 2, Gathering Blue. Currently Chapter 13. Usually Branch scampered eagerly back and forth, leading the way, then circling back. This morning he was more cautious and followed behind. The thunder was still grumbling outside, and the hallway was dimly lighted. Thomas led the way. The dog's toenails clicked on the tiles. Matt's bare feet moved silently beside him, and the only other sounds were Kira's walking stick, which made a muted thump with each step, and the dragging of her twisted leg. Like the floor above, where they lived, this was simply an empty corridor lined with closed wooden doors. Thomas turned a corner. Then he jumped back as if he had been startled by something. The others, even the dog, froze. Shh! Thomas gestured for silence with his finger to his mouth. Ahead, around the corner, they heard footsteps. Then a knock, the opening of a door, and a voice. The voice and the inflection of the words, though the words themselves were not clear, sounded familiar to Kira. "It's Jameson," she mouthed silently to Thomas. He nodded, agreeing, and peered around the corner. It occurred to Kira that Jameson had been her defender, had been the one responsible for her being here at all in this new life. So there was really no reason to huddle here in the dim hallway, hiding from him. Yet she was oddly fearful. She tiptoed forward and leaned beside Thomas. They could see that one of the doors was open. An indistinct murmur of voices came from within. One voice was Jameson's. The other was that of a child. The child cried briefly. Jameson spoke. Then the child, surprisingly, began to sing. Its clear, high voice soared. No words, just the voice, almost instrument-like in its clarity. It rose, leveled at a high note, and hovered there for a long moment. Kira felt something tug at her clothing. She looked down and saw Matt beside her, wide-eyed, pulling at her skirt. She motioned to him to stay silent. Then the singing broke off abruptly, and the child cried again. They heard Jameson's voice. It was harsh now. Kira had never heard him speak in that way. The door slammed shut, and the voices were muted. Matt was still tugging at her, and Kira leaned down so that he could whisper what he had to say. "It's me friend," he said urgently. "Well, not really me friend, 'cause me and my mates don't like the girl Tykes none. But I knowed her. She lived in the fen." Thomas was listening too. "The one who was singing?" he asked. Matt nodded enthusiastically. "Her name be Jo. She always be singing in the fen. I didn't never hear her cry like that none." "Shh!" Kira tried to quiet Matt, but he had had a difficult time whispering. "Let's go back," she suggested. "We can talk in my room." Branch led now, happy to be retreating and enthusiastic about the possibility of more food back where breakfast had been. Stealthily they climbed the stairs and returned. Safe in Kira's quarters, Matt perched on the bed with his bare feet dangling and told them about the girl who sang. "She be littler than me," he said. He jumped briefly on the floor and held his own hand level with his shoulder. "She be about this high, and all the peoples in the fen, they get so happy hearing her sing." He climbed back onto the bed. Branch jumped up beside him and curled on Kira's pillow. "But why is she here?" Kira asked, puzzled. Matt gave an exaggerated shrug. "She be an orphan now. Her mum and pa, they died," he explained. "Both of them? At the same time?" Kira and Thomas looked at each other. They both knew loss, but it had happened again? To another Tyke? Matt nodded importantly. He liked being the messenger, the bringer of information. "First her mum gets the sickness, and then when draggers take her mum to the field, and her pa go to watch the spirit?" Kira and Thomas nodded. "Well," Matt said, making a dramatically sad face, "her pa be so sad at the field, sitting there, that he'd taken a big pointy stick and stab hisself through the heart. That's what them all said anyways," he added, seeing the shocked looks his story had produced. "But he had a Tyke. He had a little girl," Kira said, finding it unbelievable that a father would do such a thing. Matt shrugged again. He considered that. "Maybe he didn't like her none," he suggested. Then after a moment he frowned and said, But how could he not like her none when she sings so good? And how did she get here? Thomas asked. What is she doing here? I've been told they gave her away to someone who had a craving for more tykes, Matt said. Kira nodded. Orphans always go to someone else. Unless, Thomas said slowly. Unless what? Kira and Matt asked together. He pondered that. Unless they sing, he said at last. Jameson came to Kira's room, as he always did, later in the day. Outside, the rain still fell. Matt, undaunted, had gone off with his dog to find his mates, wherever they might be in such weather. Thomas had returned to his own quarters to work, and Kira, too, with extra lamps lighted by the tender, had settled to her task, stitching carefully throughout the afternoon. The interruption when Jameson knocked on her door was welcome. The tender brought tea, and they sat companionably together in the room while the rain spattered against the windows. As usual, he examined her work carefully. His face was the same creased, pleasant face that she had known now for many weeks. His voice was courteous and friendly as together they scrutinized the folds of the outstretched robe. Yet the memory of the harsh sound of his murmured speech in the room below prevented Kira from asking him about the singing child. Your work is very fine, Jameson told her. He leaned forward, looking carefully at the section she had just completed, where she had meticulously matched the subtle differences of several yellows and filled in a background area with tiny knotted stitches that formed a texture. Better than your mother's, although hers was excellent, he added. She taught you the stitches? Kira nodded. Yes, most of them. She didn't tell him how others seemed to simply come to her, untaught. It seemed boastful to speak of it. And Annabella the dyes, she added. I'm using many of her threads still, but I'm beginning now to make my own when I'm at her cot. She knows all there is, the old woman, Jameson said. He looked at Kira's leg with apparent concern. The walk is not too hard for you? One day we'll have the fire pit and the pots here for you. I'm thinking of preparing a place just below. He gestured toward the window, indicating an area between the building and the edge of the woods beyond. No, I'm strong, but... She hesitated. Yes? Sometimes I've been fearful on the path, Kira told him. The forest is so close all around. There is nothing to be afraid of there. I do fear beasts, she confessed. As you should, but stay on the path always. The beasts will not come near the path. His voice was as reassuring as it had been the day of her trial. I heard growling once, Kira confided, shuddering a little at the memory of it. There is nothing to fear if you don't stray. Annabella said the same thing. She told me there was nothing to fear. She speaks with 4-syllable wisdom. But, Jameson? For some reason, Kira hesitated to tell him this. Perhaps she didn't want to question the old woman's knowledge. But now, feeling reassured by Jameson's interest and concern, she told him the startling thing that the old dyer had said with such certainty. She said that there be no beasts. He looked at Kira oddly. The expression on his face seemed a mixture of astonishment and anger. No beasts? She said that? There be no beasts, Kira repeated. She said it just that way, several times. Jameson laid the section of robe he'd been examining back down on the table. She's very old, he said firmly. It's dangerous for her to speak that way. Her mind is beginning to wander. Kira looked at him dubiously. For weeks now, she had worked with the dyer, the lists of plants, the many characteristics of each, the details of the dyeing procedures, so much complex knowledge. All of it was clear and complete. Kira had seen no sign, no hint of a wandering mind. Might the old woman know something that no one else, even someone with the status of Jameson, knew? Have you seen beasts? Kira asked him hesitantly. Many, many times. The woods are filled with them, Jameson said. Never stray past the village limits. Do not go beyond the path. Kira looked at him. His expression was hard to discern, but his voice was firm and certain. "Don't forget, Kira," he continued, "I saw your father taken by beasts. It was a hideous thing. Terrible." Jameson sighed and patted her hand sympathetically. Then he turned to leave. "You are doing a fine job," he said again, appreciatively. "Thank you," Kira murmured. She put her hand, still feeling his touch, into her pocket. Her special scrap of cloth lay folded there. She felt no comfort from it. As the door closed behind Jameson, she stroked the cloth, seeking its solace, but it seemed to withdraw from her touch, almost as if it were trying to warn her of something. The rain still fell steadily. Through it, she thought for a moment that she could hear the child's sob on the floor below. Hello to anybody who has just joined us. You have stumbled upon a book reading. Chapter 14. The sun was shining in the morning, but Kira woke groggy after a fitful sleep. Following an early breakfast, she tied her sandals carefully, anticipating the walk to Annabella's. Maybe the clear, cooler air after the rain would wake her a bit and make her feel better. Her head ached. Thomas's door was closed. He was probably still asleep. There were no sounds either from the floor below. Kira made her way out of doors, relishing the breeze that lingered after the storm and was pine-scented from trees that were still glistening and wet. It blew her hair away from her face, and the misery of her sleepless night began to subside. Leaning on her stick, Kira made her way to the place where she ordinarily turned from the village and entered the woods on the path. It was quite near the weaving shed. "Kira!" A woman's voice called to her from the shed, and she saw that it was Marlena, already at the loom so early. Kira smiled, waved, and detoured to greet the woman. "We miss you. Them tykes that clean up for us now are worthless, horrid lazy, and one stole my lunch yesterday." Marlena scowled her outrage. Her feet slowed on the treadle, and Kira knew that she was eager to chat and gossip. "That be him now, that wicked tyke." A familiar wet nose touched Kira's ankle. She reached down to scratch a branch and saw Matt grinning at her from behind the corner of the weaving shed. "You there!" Marlena called angrily, and he drew back to hide. "Marlena?" Kira asked, remembering that the weaving woman lived in the fen. "Did you ever know a girl tyke named Jo?" "Jo?" The woman was still peering toward the shed corner, hoping to catch a glimpse of Matt and scold him. "You there!" she called again, but Matt was too sly and too clever to respond. "Yes, she used to sing." "Ah, the singing tyke, yes, I knowed her. Not her name, though, but her singing. We all knowed that. Like a bird it was." "What happened to her?" Marlena shrugged. Her feet began to move slowly again on the treadle. "She be tooken off. They give her off to somebody, I guess. She be orphaned, I heard." She leaned forward and whispered loudly. "Some said her received the songs by magic. Nobody teached her. The songs, they just come." Her feet paused. She gestured to Kira to come closer. Furtively, Marlena confided. "I heard that them songs was full of knowledges. She be only a small tyke, you know. But when she singed, she had knowledges of things that wasn't even happened yet." "I never heard of it myself. Only heard tell of it." Marlena laughed, and her feet took up the rapid pace on the treadle that caused the rhythmic motion of the loom. Kira nodded goodbye to her and started toward the path. Matt met her there, appearing from behind a tree where he'd been hiding. Kira glanced back, but Marlena was busy at her loom and had forgotten them both. "Are you coming with me this morning?" she asked Matt. "I thought you found it boring at the dyer's hut." "You mustn't go today," Matt said solemnly. Then he glanced at his dog and began to laugh. "Looky! Old Branch, him trying to catch him a Lizzie." Kira looked and laughed too. Branch had chased a small lizard to the base of a tree and was watching, frustrated as it slithered up the trunk beyond his reach. He stood on his hind legs, and his front ones churned in the air. The lizard looked back, and a moist stiletto tongue darted in and out. Kira watched for a moment, chuckling, and then turned again to Matt. "What do you mean I mustn't go? I missed yesterday because of the rain. She's expecting me." Matt looked solemn. She'd not be expecting nobody. She'd be gone to the field right when the sun be coming up. Draggers tooken her. I seen it. To the field? What are you talking about, Matt? She couldn't possibly walk to the field from her cot. It's too far, and she's too old. And she wouldn't want to anyway. Matt rolled his eyes. I didn't say she'd be wanting to. I said they tooken her. She'd be dead. Dead? Annabella? How can that be? Kira was stunned. She had seen the old woman 2 days before. They had sipped tea together. Matt took her question seriously. "It be like this," he replied. He flung himself on the ground, lay on his back with both arms outstretched, opened his eyes wide, and stared blankly upward. Branch, curious, nosed at his neck, but Matt held the pose. Kira stared in dismay at his grotesque but accurate imitation of death. "Don't, Matt," she said at last. "Get up. Don't do that." Matt sat up and took the dog into his lap. He tilted his head and looked at Kira curiously. "Probably they be giving you her stuff," he announced. "You're certain it was Annabella?" Matt nodded. "I seen her face when they tooken her to the field." Briefly, he made the death face again, with its blank eyes. Kira bit her lip. She turned away from the path. Matt was correct. She should not go into the woods now, but she did not know where to go. She could wake Thomas, she supposed, but for what? Thomas had never met the old dyer. Finally, she turned and looked back at the large council edifice where she lived. The door through which she came and went was in the side wing. The large door in front was the one she had entered on the day of her trial so many weeks before. The Council of Guardians would probably not be meeting today in the big chamber where her trial had been. But Jameson must be someplace inside. She decided that she would look for him. He would know what had happened, would tell her what to do. "No, Matt," she said when the tyke began to follow her. His face fell. He had sensed an adventure. "Go wake Thomas," Kira told him. "Tell him what happened. Tell him that Annabella has died, and that I have gone to find Jameson." "Jameson? Who's he?" Kira was startled at Matt's ignorance. Jameson had become so much of a part of her life that she had forgotten the tyke wouldn't know his name. "He's the guardian who first took me to my room," she explained. "Remember? A very tall man with dark hair? You were with us that day." "He always wears one of Thomas's carvings," she added. "Quite a nice one, with an outline of a tree." Matt nodded at that. "I seen him," he said eagerly. "Where?" Kira looked around. If Jameson was nearby, if she could find him at one of the workplaces, she wouldn't have to search the council edifice. "He be there, watching, walking beside, when the draggers took in the old dyer to the field," Matt said. So Jameson already knew. The corridors were, as always, quiet and dim. At first, Kira felt secretive and stealthy, as if she could make her footsteps as silent as possible. Difficult with her stick and her dragging leg. Then she reminded herself that she was not hiding, not in danger. She was simply looking for the man who had been her mentor since her mother's death. Could she even, if she chose, call his name loudly in hopes that he would hear and respond. But calling out seemed inappropriate, and so she simply continued down the hall in silence. As she had expected, the great hall was empty. She knew that it was used only for special occasions, the annual gathering, trials such as her own, and other ceremonies that she had never seen. She pulled the huge door open a crack, peeked in, and turned away to look elsewhere in the building. She knocked timidly on several doors. Finally, at one, a voice answered with a gruff, "Yes," and she pushed the door open to see one of the tenders, a man she didn't recognize, busy at a desk. "I'm looking for Jameson," Kira explained. The tender shrugged. "He's not here." She could see that. "Do you know where he might be?" she asked politely. "In the wing, probably." The tender looked down again at his work. He seemed to be sorting papers. Kira knew that the wing was where her own quarters were. That made sense. Probably Jameson was looking for her even now, to tell her of the old woman's death. She had started out much earlier than usual this morning, thinking to make up for the day wasted yesterday by rain. If she had waited, Jameson could have found her, told her of the death, explained, and she would not feel so shocked and solitary. "Excuse me, but can I get to the wing from here without going back outside?" Impatiently, the tender gestured to his left. "Door at the end," he said. Kira thanked him, closed his office door behind her, and went to the end of the long hall. The door there was not locked, and when she opened it, she saw a familiar stairway. She had tiptoed down it with Thomas and Matt just yesterday during the storm. She knew the stairs would return her to the corridor above, where she would find her room and Thomas's. She stood motionless and listened. The tender had said that Jameson was probably somewhere in the wing, but she heard no sound. On a whim, instead of taking the stairs to her room, Kira remained on the first floor. She went to the corner where she and Thomas had hidden the day before, the same corner they had peered around to see where the crying was coming from. In the silence and emptiness, she rounded the corner and approached the door that had been open the afternoon before. She leaned next to it, her ear against the wood, and listened. But there was no sound of crying, none of singing. After a moment, she tried the knob, but the door was locked. Finally, very softly, she knocked. She heard a rustling sound inside, then the muffled sound of small footsteps on a bare floor. She knocked softly again. She heard a whimper. Kira knelt by the door. It was difficult with her crippled leg, but she lowered herself until her mouth was beside the large keyhole. Then she called softly, "Joe?" "I'm being good," a frightened, desperate little voice replied. "I'm practicing." "I know you are," Kira said through the keyhole. She could hear small, shuddering sobs. "I'm your friend, Joe. My name is Kira." "Please, I want me mum," the tyke pleaded. She sounded very young. For some reason, Kira thought of the enclosure that had been built on the site of her old cot. Now tykes were penned there, enclosed by thorn bushes. It seemed cruel, but at least they were not isolated. They had each other, and they were able to look out through the thick foliage and see the village life around them. Why was this small tyke locked in a room all alone? "I will come back," she called softly through the door. "Will you bring me mum?" The little voice was close to the keyhole. Kira could almost feel the breath. Matt had told her that the tyke's parents were both dead. "I will come back," Kira said again. "Joe, listen to me." The tyke sniffled. In the distance, on the floor above, Kira heard a door open. "I must go," Kira whispered firmly through the hole. "But listen. Listen, Joe. I will help you. I promise. Hush now, and don't tell anyone I was here." She rose quickly, clutching her stick, and made her way back to the staircase. When she reached the second floor and rounded the corner, she saw Jameson standing in the open doorway to her room. He came forward, greeted her with sympathy, and told her the news of Annabella's death. Suddenly wary, Kira said nothing of the child below. The plot is thickening, guys. Chapter 15. Our final chapter for the evening, I think. "Look, they're setting up a dying place for me." It was midday. Kira pointed down to the area below the window, a small piece of land between the edifice and the edge of the woods. Thomas came to the window and looked. Workers had raised a structure that Kira could see was to be a shed. Under its roof, long poles from which to hang the wet yarns and threads to dry were already in place. "It's better than anything she ever had," Kira murmured, remembering Annabella wistfully. "I'm going to miss her," she added. It all happened so quickly. Annabella's death, so sudden, and now, only a day later, the new dying place was being made. "What's that?" Thomas pointed. To the side, the workers were digging a shallow pit. A support for hanging kettles was being pounded into place at the side. "It'll be for fire. You need a very hot fire always, for the boiling of the dyes." "Oh, Thomas," Kira sighed, turning away from the window. "I'll never remember how to do it all." "Yes, you will. I have it all written down. Everything you told me. We'll just repeat it and repeat it. Look, what's that they're bringing?" She looked again and saw them stacking bundles of dried plants beside the new shed. They must have brought all the ones Annabella had hanging from the beams in her cot. So at least I'll have a place to start. I think I know the names, if they haven't mixed them all together out of ignorance. Then she chuckled, watching one of the workers set down a covered pot and turn his face away with a grimace of disgust. "It's the mordant," Kira explained. "It smells terrible." She didn't want to say the rude word to Thomas, but it was what Annabella had called her piss pot, and its contents were a surprisingly vital ingredient in the making of the dyes. The workers had begun to arrive early that morning, bearing the kettles and plants and equipment, while Jameson was still in Kira's room describing the events of the day before. A sudden death, he had explained, the way death often came to those of great age. She slept, Annabella had, napping on the rainy day, and didn't wake. That was all. No mystery to it. Perhaps she felt that she had completed her job by teaching Kira, Jameson pointed it out solemnly. Sometimes, he told her, it was the way death came, a drifting away when one's tasks were accomplished. "And there's no need to burn her cot," he added, "because there was no illness. So it will stay as it is. Some day you can live there if you like, after you've finished your work here." Kira nodded, accepting his words. The old woman's spirit, she realized, would still be in her body. "She'll need a watcher," Kira pointed out to Jameson. "Could I go and sit with her? I did for my mother." But Jameson said no. Time was short. The gathering was coming. 4 days could not be lost. Kira must work on the robe. Others would do the watching for the old dyer. So Kira would mourn all alone. After Jameson had gone, she sat silently, remembering how solitary Annabella's chosen life had been, how unconnected to the village. Only then did it occur to Kira to wonder, who found her? How did they know to look? "Thomas, come away from the window now. I need to tell you about something." Reluctantly, he came to where she was sitting at the table, though she could see from his face that he was still listening to the noise of the construction below. Boys, Kira thought. They were always interested in such things. If Matt were around, he'd be down there underfoot, getting in the way, wanting to help with the building. "This morning," she began, then, sensing his inattention, "Thomas, listen." He grinned, turned toward her, and listened. "I went to the room below, the one where we heard the tyke crying." "And singing," Thomas reminded her. "Yes, and singing." "Her name is Jo, according to Matt," Thomas said. "See? I'm paying attention. Why did you go down there?" "I was looking for Jameson at first," Kira explained, "and I found myself on that floor. So I went to the door, thinking I might peek in and see if the tyke was all right. But it was locked." Thomas nodded. He looked unsurprised. "But they've never locked my door, Thomas," she said. "No, because you were already grown, already 2 syllables when you came here. But I was young. I was still Tom when I arrived," he said. "They locked my door." "You were held captive?" He frowned, remembering. Not really. It was to keep me safe, I think, and to make me pay attention. I was young and I didn't want to work all the time. He grinned. I was a little like Matt, I think. Playful. Were they harsh to you? Kira asked, remembering the sound of Jameson's voice speaking to the little girl. He thought. Stern, he said finally. But Thomas, the tyke below, Joe, she was crying, sobbing. She wanted her mum, she said. Matt told us her mother died. She doesn't seem to know that. Thomas tried to recall his own circumstances. I think they told me about my parents, but maybe not right away. It was a long time ago. I remember someone brought me here and showed me where everything was and how it worked. The bathroom and the hot water, Kira said with a wry smile. Yes, that, and all the tools. I was already a carver. I'd been carving for a long time. The way I'd already been doing the threadings, and the way the tyke Joe... Yes, Thomas said. Matt said she was already a singer. Kira, thinking, smoothed the folds of her skirt. So, each of us, she said slowly, was already I don't know what to call it. Artist? Thomas suggested. That's a word. I've never heard anyone say it, but I've read it in some of the books. It means, someone who is able to make something beautiful. Would that be the word? Yes, I guess it would. The tyke makes her singing, and it is beautiful. When she isn't crying, Thomas pointed out. So we are each artists, and we are each orphaned, and it brought each of us here. I wonder why. Also, Thomas, there's something else, something strange. He was listening. This morning I talked to Marlena, a woman I know from the weaving shed. She lives in the fen, and she remembered Joe, though she didn't know her name. She remembered a singing tyke. Everyone in the fen would know of such a tyke. Kira nodded, agreeing. She said, how did she put it? She tried to remember Marlena's description. She said that the tyke seemed to have knowledges. Knowledges? That was the word she used. What did she mean? She said that the tyke seemed to have knowledge of things that hadn't happened yet, that the people in the fen thought it was magic. She sounded a little frightened when she talked of it. And Thomas? What? He asked. Kira hesitated. It made me think of what happens sometimes with my cloth. This small one. Kira opened the box he had made for her and held out the scrap, reminding him. I told you how it seems to speak to me. And I remember that you told me that you have a piece of wood that seems to do the same. Yes, from when I was a tyke, just beginning to carve. The one on the shelf. I've shown it to you. Okay, good. Could it be the same thing? Kira asked cautiously. Could it be what Marlena called knowledges? Thomas looked at her, and at the cloth that lay motionless in her hand. He frowned. But why? He asked at last. Kira didn't know the answer. Maybe it is something that artists have, she said, liking the sound of the word she had just learned. A special kind of magic knowledge. Thomas nodded and shrugged. Well, it doesn't matter much, does it? We each have a good life now. Better tools than we did before. Good food. Work to do. But the tyke below, she sobs, and they won't let her out of the room. Kira remembered her promise. Thomas, I told her I'd come back, and that I'd help her. He looked dubious. I don't think the guardians would like that. Kira again remembered the severity she had heard in Jameson's voice. She remembered the slamming of the door. No, I don't think they would, she agreed. But at night, I'll creep down then, when they think we're all asleep, except... Her face fell. Except what? It's locked. There's no way I can get in. Yes, you can, Thomas told her. How? I have a key, he said. It was true. Back in his room, he showed her. It was a long time ago, he explained, but here I was, locked in with all these fine tools. So I carved a key. It really was quite easy. The lock on the door is a simple one. And, he added, fingering the intricately carved wooden key, it fits all the doors. All the locks are the same. I know because I tried them. I used to go out at night and roam the hallways, opening doors. All the rooms were empty then. Kira shook her head. You really were mischievous, weren't you? Thomas grinned. I told you, just like Matt. Tonight, Kira said, suddenly serious. Will you come with me? Thomas nodded. All right, he agreed. Tonight. All right, kids. That will bring us to the conclusion of another fantastic read, if I do say so myself. Thank you all for joining. I'm sorry. Oh, that was such a douchey thing to say. Thank you all for joining me again for another read. I enjoyed it as always. If you are catching this on YouTube later this week, come by on TikTok on Mondays. Come watch me do this live. It's great. You guys can talk to each other in the chat while I'm reading. It's great. So, but until then, I will see you guys next week. Same time, same place, of course. And until then, stay hydrated, of course, with water, not with coffee. And keep yourselves safe. I'm starting to talk like someone from the Fen, I think. And have a fantastic weekend. If you guys are doing anything fun this coming weekend, again, stay safe. And I'll see you next week. Bye.